If this is only a decision, then we've got to be pretty careful as to how much emphasis we put on the third step in terms of recovery. If it's only a decision, then it means it is the beginning and not the end. It is the beginning and not the basis of the program. But this is a pretty important decision we're making. In fact, it is crucial to our recovery. If we don't make this decision, we don't recover. Make no mistake about it. Each of us must understand that our individual recovery is our prime business, and it is nobody else's business. There are those who will help us, but they cannot get us sober. There are those who will take us through the steps and teach us what they've learned and share with us, and sometimes hold our hands, and sometimes help us stay glued together when things are coming apart. But ultimately, the responsibility for recovery is on us. And when we make the mistake of believing that our recovery is dependent on other people, we find ourselves in deep water indeed. Also, when we make the mistake of believing that somehow or another people who've been around here longer than we have power and control over us to tell us what to do, and especially to create a situation where we stay in a hole knowing that something is dead wrong, but because we're afraid that we might ruffle some feathers, we stay in that hole. Our recovery, our program, is our responsibility. And it starts out right here. That when we look at this third step, if we consider that somehow or another we've reached a high point in recovery, and that we have in fact surrendered by taking the third step, we're way off base. We make a decision to surrender. We make a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand Him, knowing full well that we are still essentially blocked off from God.
Jim, you said that if we work the steps, that we develop a sixth sense.
Yes.
What is that sixth sense? Does everybody develop it? Or?
Yes. What the sixth sense means is that we have developed an affinity for God. That means that we are able to be inspired, to be intuitively in touch with our higher power. That's the sixth sense. And we know that's true when we get to the 11th step, which immediately follows, and it tells us that we will not be inspired at all times. But eventually, as we continue to pray and meditate, we will come to rely upon the intuition and the intuitive thoughts that we receive. Now then, if we look then at chapter 5, what else do we find that we need to be convinced of? Well, for example, if you have decided that you want what we have and are willing to go to any length to get it, there's one thought. Willing to go to any length to get it. Then, it doesn't say next year or when your lazy sponsor gets around to it. It says then you are ready to take certain steps. It means exactly what it says. If you don't understand that or don't believe that, go to the 7th chapter and you will find that in the 7th chapter the person who has read the book and is meeting for the second time with their spiritual advisor is asked, do you want what we have? Are you willing to follow along with what we did? If the answer is yes, you take them immediately to the steps. That's what the book tells us to do. And it's right. They did not fool around. All of these things are found in the reading just prior to this statement, being convinced. Now, are we convinced that these things are true? And for example, are we convinced that the 12 steps are there for us? Are we convinced that we are going to work those steps? Because if we're not, we can't take the third step. The third step is not the step by which we recover. Now, many people have come to rely upon the third step, understanding in their own way that the third step constitutes the step of surrender. That is, if I keep using the third step prayer, I stay in a state of surrender. The Big Book says the third step will have little permanent effect unless at once followed by a strenuous effort to find and to be rid of the things in ourselves which have been blocking us from God. What good is it for us to make up our minds to surrender if we are still blocked? To surrender to what? If our surrender is to be to a loving God, we've got to be free to accept God into our lives, to accept His direction and His control. And while we're blocked from Him, we cannot do that. Nevertheless, this third step is a vital and crucial step because it takes us well beyond the second step, doesn't it? The second step is a belief. We came to believe that there was this all-powerful being out there who was strong enough, certainly powerful enough, to restore us to sanity. This does not mean that we necessarily at that point had accepted God as a personal God. That is, a deity to whom we could appeal and expect it or him to have a personal interest in us. And this is the dilemma of no faith. This is the dilemma that so many people have coming in. They don't have any great difficulty in believing there's some power out there. But to believe that that power is not too busy to have a personal interest in little me is a long jump, a long stretch. So we need to be convinced of all of these things if we are to move forward. Now the Big Book goes into quite a discussion of what we're coming from. When we walk through the door and our prior history, and it pretty much tells us the same thing for each of us. But here's the story is simple, that we have been living on self-propulsion, and that we're all like actors who want to run the whole show. And the way that Big Book describes it is this: if we decided to put on a play, that we would write the script, we would write the incidental music, of course, we would hire the actors, we would produce the play, we would direct the play, we would direct the scenery being made, we would rehearse the orchestra, conduct the orchestra, be the prompter under the stage, sell the tickets, and bring people down the aisle to seat them. Now, when that play didn't come off very well, we would blame the critics that they didn't understand a good play when they saw it. It was everybody else's fault but ours. And to find out that this is the way we've been trying to live our lives. I have a friend in Pensacola who used to say, if I'm not God, there is no God. And each of us were trying to be general managers of our own universe. And so, here's what the Big Book brings us to. And this is a hard pill to swallow because we've been going along deaf, dumb, blind, and stupid, thinking that it was everybody's fault out there but our own. And unfortunately, there are many those in the professions who love to feed us all of the material we need to have to come to the conclusion that none of these things are our fault. That we have been victims of circumstances, victims of the venality of other people, even as a matter of fact to begin to blame God for the circumstances in which we were born, or for a lack of education, and so on and so on and so on. And we take all of these excuses for our crapped out behavior and we hold them to our bosoms because this means that we're not wrong. We didn't do anything wrong. It's all everybody else's fault. And our failures in our relationships are always the fault of the other person. And our failures in business are always the fault of the people we were working with, or the boss, or the employees we had, or the Federal Reserve, or the federal government, or somebody is responsible for our failures, not us. We cannot and will not face the fact that our lives and the results in our lives are our responsibility. It isn't a question of blame. It's a question of responsibility. So the big book goes to great lengths to disabuse us of the idea that somehow or another we have an excuse. Somehow or another we do not have to look to ourselves to see what the real problem is. And those two paragraphs on page 62 are some of the most important language we'll ever read in any book, anywhere, anytime, because they bring it all back to us. There are problems of our own making, that they arise out of ourselves, that an alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot, though he or she usually doesn't think so. That we're driven by 100 forms of fear, selfishness, self-centeredness, self-doubt, self-delusion, self-centered fear. And we're driven by these forces. And we go out and step on the toes of our fellows, and they retaliate, and we think many times without provocation. But we inevitably find that at some time in the past we have taken actions or made decisions which have now come back to haunt us, in which we have harmed others. Then it goes on to tell us this, and this is so critically important because it goes right to the guts of the program and goes right to the core of the 12 steps. That we have to be rid of this selfishness. We have to, or it kills us. That seems like a pretty wild statement, pretty radical. That just because I'm selfish and act selfishly and I'm full of self-centered fear, that this is going to kill me? Now, how in the world can we get to that conclusion? Where does the big book come up with that? It's easy. Think about it just for a second. Because what we have to do is we always have to go back to the basics to see how all of these things fit together and how this solution, this spiritual solution, the 12 steps actually works. And what our real trouble is, we have to go back to the basic. The basic fact is that we are powerless. We're powerless over alcohol. We cannot stop drinking on our own. Our most fervent desires and actions, as marshaled by the will, failed utterly. Alcoholism is a fatal, incurable, progressive illness. We have two choices. Either to go on to the bitter end, and it will be bitter, or to accept a spiritual way of life. Those are our two choices. When people talk about, I have choices now that I'm here, those are the choices we have. Now then, if I cannot be freed from my alcoholism myself, and if it is true that it is a fatal, progressive, incurable illness, then whatever will block me off from the spiritual solution for my problem will kill me. Now it becomes pretty simple. Selfishness and self-centeredness means that our heads are filled with self. When I'm buried in my own head, that is a perfect definition of insanity. All of those thoughts in collision with each other, running around in there, no resolution of anything, no way to concentrate on anything, simply centered on self, and I'm nuts. We're screwy when we come in the door. Our minds don't work right. And the most damaging problem of all is this selfishness. because we have to be free of it or it'll kill us. And it kills us because a head full of self has no room for God. If we wish to have God in our lives, if we wish to become God conscious and enter the world of spirit, if we wish to be unblocked from the sunlight of the Spirit, we must be free of selfishness. And if we do not get so unblocked, if we are not able to enter into the sunlight of the Spirit and be God conscious, we do not recover. Because our only hope is a loving God and His power. Remember what we came to believe in the second step? That this power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. That's what we have to have. We have to have restoration to sanity. And because we are crazy ourselves, we can't cure a sick mind with a sick mind. We don't have a chance in hell. And the big book goes on to explain this to us, that we can have all of the most wonderful concerns. Our motives can be great. We can wish with all of our might to be free of this selfishness. But we can't do it ourselves. In other words, we are as powerless over self as we are over alcohol. And then it tells us that God will remove from us this selfishness. That God can do it. And so now, here's the problem. How am I going to be free from this selfishness? How am I going to be saved from an alcoholic death? Well, the first thing I have to do is decide that hereafter I'm not going to play God anymore. This is a major step. Unfortunately, for many of us, we are not told that this step does not have to be made by us. Not alone, because we're not alone anymore. We already have received the gift of the first step. We've received the gift of the second step. In the first step, we accepted as a fact our alcoholism. We learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholics. In other words, we made an unconditional surrender to the power of alcohol in our lives. We also learned, and we were given the gift of understanding and acceptance, that we could no longer ever contemplate taking a drink again, because we can never drink safely ever again. The plug is in the jug. In the second step, we came to believe, and people might have beat us around the head and shoulders to make us believe. That didn't work. But when we were going to meetings, when we were reading the book, when we were praying and meditating a little bit, and when we were talking and conversing and taking the advice of people who had been here before us and had solid programs, what happened was that first we became willing to believe, and then the belief came. And when that happened, we were able to take our second step. Now, assuming that we've taken the proper first and second steps, we are now at this place where we have come to believe that this power out there can restore us to sanity. The next step is that we're going to have to do our part to fit ourselves into God's scheme of things. And it becomes pretty obvious that the thing we must do is commence the process now of surrender. If we're going to reach out for surrender, if we're going to seek God, and we're going to seek to surrender, and we're going to seek to be obedient to His will, we have to start it right here. And so what happens to us is that even though we may be fighting with the idea, it does finally come to us, and we do make a decision that, yes, indeed, I'm going to let God be the Father, and I'm going to be the child. And when that decision comes fully to focus for us, there is this great sense of release and relief that I'm no longer alone. I no longer have to continue to try to fight this life on my own. I never realized just how lonely I was out there. And all these people promised me all these wonderful things, but none of them ever happened. And I had the education, and I had the job or the career, and I made some money, and it was all ashes in my mouth. And I have never had a relationship that was worth a damn. My relationships had always been unhealthy and failures. And when I look back on it, I realize I failed in every aspect of my life. Even if I had accumulated a lot of things, not a single one of them ever brought me real happiness. And this includes the people who have been in my life. So now I get to look at an entirely different way of life. A way of life where God is the Father and I'm the child, and God's in charge of things, and all I have to do is my part. And so the big book goes on to tell us at the top of page 63 something which is of extraordinary importance for us to understand. It tells us that when we sincerely take this position of surrender, this decision, not only the decision, but the commitment to go forward with the rest of the steps, all sorts of remarkable things will follow. That we had a new employer. And then it tells us this, that being all-powerful, He provided what we needed, everything we need. He provided what we needed if we do two things: stay close to Him and perform His work for Him. That's our job. This is what we're committing ourselves to do. But first we must get close to God, and then we must stay close to Him. This means that we put ourselves on a spiritual path and we stay there. We put ourselves on a path to stay spiritually fit. But more than that, we put ourselves on a path to fit ourselves to be of maximum service to God. The big book tells us that even though we may be at this moment trying to set our lives in order, this is not an end in itself. That our real purpose is to fit ourselves to be of maximum service to God and the people about us. Period. That's our real purpose. And when we understand that, we really truly begin to understand what this recovery is all about. It doesn't have a damn thing to do with about not drinking. Because we're not going to drink when we're spiritually fit. The obsession to drink and the compulsion to drink will be removed. That's the promise when we seek God. Quit worrying about that. Our job is, by working these spiritual steps, to bring ourselves to a place where we can be of maximum service to God. So therefore we can stay close to Him and we can perform His work well. And under those circumstances we will be given everything we need. We can quit worrying about it. We can get up every morning and take a little inventory of what's to be done during the day and set about doing the next thing as it presents itself, doing the next right thing, not hurting anybody else, and leaving the results up to God, and our lives just turn around. That's all we have to do. Yes, Tom?
Wouldn't you call a compulsion the same as a power greater than myself?
Well, the compulsion is internalized, of course, and it's part of the disease, but it denies the existence of any power. It denies the existence of morals and ethics, and denies the existence of our fears and our self-knowledge and all the other things that might keep us from drinking. The compulsion simply is what it says. We are compelled to drink. That's what it means. We are compelled to drink. It is precisely as if alcohol had a 9mm at our head and was telling us to either drink or die, sucker.
So alcohol would be the higher power. I'd be a god. Like when I was drinking, I would do stuff to get my alcohol.
Well, of course.
It always set me up for worse things.
That's a good point, because the genesis of that belief system is simple. When we started out drinking, we were filled with fear and anxiety. Alcohol took away the fear. it became our very best friend, because it would relieve us of the pain and suffering of our fears temporarily. But we would give up anything to have that temporary surcease from the pain and discomfort of fear. And nothing else would do it, except those of us who also turned to drugs. But we got exactly the same result. And some of these drugs, as I understand them, the result is maybe 5 minutes. And yet we'll kill to get that 5 minutes. That's insane. Utterly, totally insane. Anybody that thinks that we come in these doors sane is out of their mind. If that sounds like a conundrum, it certainly is. But now we've got something that has been given to us without any cost to us, freely given to us, a miracle. You remember, guys, that 67 years ago, there was no hope for any of us. We were dead ducks. Period. And then these 12 steps were given to us. And these 12 steps are all those same spiritual principles we have been taught all our lives, if we were church goers or temple goers or ashram goers or whatever we went. But nobody ever told us how to take these spiritual principles and make them a part of our lives. They told us to be good, they didn't show us how. They told us to be moral, they didn't show us how. The steps show us precisely, step by step by step, what actions to take to incorporate these spiritual principles into our lives so they become a part of our very being. That's the genius of the steps. 67 years ago we had no chance. Now we're given this miracle, and it requires of us only that we be willing to put out some effort. Dr. Bob identified the amount of effort necessary to successfully stay sober and to grow spiritually as being half that which we used to put into getting the next drink. Yeah.
You said that there was 2 points to the third step, was to stay close to him and do his work well.
Yes.
His work. What
The 12th step tells us what it is. Carry this message to other alcoholics. The big book goes beyond that. In the 7th step, it tells us we ask God to take away those defects of character which block us off from Him and which keep us from being of maximum service to Him and our fellows. And again, on page 77, it tells us our real purpose here is to fit ourselves to be of maximum service to God and the people about us. But at the very least, it is carrying this message to other alcoholics. That's our job. That's what we're here for. That's our mission. Did you ever stop to think how important it is to have a purpose in life? How many of us came in here having been adrift all of our lives? We're born, life is a bitch, and we die, so what? We spend all of our time trying hard and desperately to secure our safety, to survive, and to maybe have a little bit of fun along the way. And what the things that we think are fun are all the things that we've been induced to think are fun. And we find out that that brand new car is old in a week. We find out that that house that we coveted has to have the lawn mowed and the trash taken out and needs repairs every time we turn around. And that woman we desperately needed turns out to be a champion honeydewer. Because, you see, we're not able to look at that wife we acquired and look at the beauty of her soul and her spirit and meld our spirit with hers, because we're so tied up in self, it's impossible for us to do that. And since she cannot satisfy us and keep us happy through all of the things that we expect of her, we get tired of her right quick. Of course, if she's the same as we are, she's gotten tired of us too. For probably even better reasons. And so when we look at all of this, we have to recognize, guys, that what we're talking about with these 12 steps is something far, far beyond not drinking. And until we understand that, we're going to find ourselves in a jackpot, because we're going to focus on the problem of not drinking, and somebody's going to convince us that all we have to do is keep it green. Which means that we have to stay afraid of the next drink, which militates directly against what the Big Book tells us, which is simply this: nobody stays sober on fear. Or that we're going to stay sober because we know so much about ourselves. We went to 16 different treatment centers. We've been on 7 different psychiatrist couches. We've had multitudinous counselors and facilitators and all these people. And because we've done all this, we know all about ourselves. We know exactly why we drink. And we know all about what will happen if we do drink. So therefore, we'll never drink again. Wrong. Fear and self-knowledge do not keep us sober. Our one hope is exactly what the Big Book says. We have to have a spiritual awakening. That's our hope. But it's a whole lot more than a hope. When you read the book and you study what's happened with everybody who went before you and talk to people who've been there before, they'll tell you flat out, you do this work, you will recover. I can look you right in the eye anytime if you're new, and I can tell you this: you do exactly what the Big Book directs you to do. I promise you that you will be just fine. Because I know that that's true. I know that that's true. There's no doubt in my mind. I'm not going to weasel a word around and say, oh, well, you know, it's kind of baloney. Dr. Bob was not a liar. Dr. Bob was probably the closest thing to a saint we ever had around here. In his story, he made the flat statement that it never fails. Think about that. And he had taken over 5,000 people through their steps. He was the greatest 12-stepper of all time. Greatest there ever will be. And he said it never fails. And all we have to do is go about it with 1/2 the zeal we used to go about getting our next drink. That's it. And this decision is not something which can be forced upon us. It isn't. We're not going to arrive at this decision because we have answered 4,000 questions and laid on 16 couches or gone to 14 rehabs. We're not going to come to this decision because somebody has forced us to make it. We cannot force ourselves to make this decision. It must come, and it will. This decision comes as a great gift to us. The decision that we're going to turn our life and our will over to the care of God as we understand it. Now please go to the top of page 63. We're going to study these paragraphs on 63 together because these are crucial, vital. The first paragraph at the top of page 63 is a paragraph which you can very profitably meditate on. This paragraph seems to speak in the present, but it does not really. It's really talking about what's going to happen. This paragraph contains within it, not in the same language, but the same meaning, all of the same promises we find after the 9th step. So it's looking forward. And the key to that is saying that when we sincerely took such a position, that means a position of surrender. And we must know now that surrender is not going to occur in the 3rd step. We're not going to stay sober on the 3rd step, although many try to do so. But that's a false alley. It's a blind alley. Because we haven't gotten rid of the things that block us from God yet. But when we sincerely take the position of surrender, which means when we have cleared away the wreckage of our past and been cleared of the things which block us from God, when we have entered the world of the Spirit and become God-conscious and been restored to sanity and developed a vital 6th sense and had a spiritual awakening, which these are things which occur in the 10th, 11th, and 12th steps, then we will be in a place of surrender. So we're going to take our past as it teaches us lessons, and we're going to look to the future, and we're going to have vision for what we wish to have in our future, and we're going to work toward that vision, never forgetting that God alone is going to be responsible for the results of our actions. Now then, the next two sentences define Alcoholics Anonymous. We had a new employer, capitalized. That word is capitalized because it stands for God. It doesn't stand for the AA group or pickup truck or an ashtray or doorknob. We had a new employer. Now listen to this. This is the sentence which defines Alcoholics Anonymous. This is what's happening. This is where we're going. Being all-powerful, He provided what we needed. That means, literally, everything we need. He provided what we needed if we stayed close to Him and performed His work well. Staying close to God means that first we get close to Him, because at this point we are not. We are still blocked off by our guilt, remorse, and shame, by our insanities, and by our defects of character. We must be freed from these to be close to God. When is it that we become God conscious, enter the world of spirit? Not till we reach the 10th step, although some of us begin to have much relief by the time of the 5th step. But the promise is clear that by the time we reach the 10th step, if we have followed directions carefully and completely in the big book, not in any other book, not in any forms from any treatment center or publisher, but in the big book, follow the directions in the big book, that we will, by the 10th step, have entered the world of spirit and become God conscious. So we know it's going to happen. Now, what this sentence says is to stay close to Him. That means once having arrived at that place, we from there on must stay close. Look at the 11th step. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God. We are improving something which we now have received. The conscious contact has come to us. The 11th step teaches us that we're from now on to seek to improve that conscious contact and perform His work well. Look at the 12th step. It is in the 12th step that we are going to carry this message to other alcoholics and to practice these principles in all of our affairs. Now what happens? Established on such a footing, we became less and less interested in ourselves, our little plans and designs. Self has been stripped away from us. That's what that means. More and more we became interested in seeing what we could contribute to life. Instead of being a taker, we now become a giver. Yes, Howie?
Yeah, are you saying that one must complete the 12 steps prior to helping another suffering alcoholic?
Not at all. Not at all. If you're one day sobriety and somebody asks for help, share that day with them.
Would you consider that sponsorship if somebody comes?
No. I don't care what you call it. It's probably, you better not call it sponsorship, because ideally a sponsor ought to be prepared to take a new person through the steps. And if you haven't worked steps yourself, you're very unlikely going to be able to do that. The question is a good one. Remember the experience of the Cleveland group when the Cleveland Plain Dealer published a series of articles in the early days about AA. And they had 10 or 15, I guess 15, maybe 20 members. Series of 7 articles, one day for a week. And the requests started coming in, and the old-timers tried to go out and meet with all these people. And they were able to bring a few into meetings who got one day of sobriety. And the old-timers thought, well, nobody can do this but us, but we're stuck. Somebody's calling. There are 40 calls that have come in. I know you only have a day's sobriety. Go out and talk to them. Guess what happened? These one-day sobriety people were bringing back recruits too. So they had to stop and say to themselves, well, one-day sobriety is more than the people who are calling probably have, but the most important thing is that the new person who goes out to talk to them can tell them from first-hand knowledge, there's a bunch of people here who know what they're doing. They know how to recover. You ought to come on with me. Let's go do it. So I would never say you do not offer help, no matter how far you've been in the steps. I mean, if it had been so that nobody could do that, we wouldn't have that picture up there, would we, Howie?
Well, again, I know Dr. Bob had about 3 days of...
You know who that is? It's Bill Wilson
Yeah.
and Dr. Bob. And it was Bill D on this A number 3. Dr. Bob has been sober, what, maybe 2 weeks? And he was right in there doing what the 12 step says, carrying the message. Okay? Good question. All right, now then. So we're going to see that as we go forward with this, and as God works His miracles with us, that we're going to become more interested in seeing we contribute to life. And then this one sentence covers the whole range of our problems. As we felt new power flow in, and of course remember we've had to come to the conclusion that all this time we've been powerless. So now we're going to be receiving God's power. As we enjoyed peace of mind, which we probably never have had, as we discovered we could face life successfully, which pretty obviously we weren't able to do. As we became conscious of His presence, and remember now that God consciousness occurs at the 10th step. You'll find it on page 85 if you want to look there, in the last full paragraph. Became conscious of His presence and began to lose our fear of today, tomorrow, or the hereafter. We were reborn. Now, what the sentence means that we're commenced to lose our fear, that really begins in the 4th step, continues in the 5th step. Well, what this is really talking about is that we commence to lose our propensity to develop fears. And the reason for that is that we will have begun to develop significant faith. And faith and fear cannot live in the same house. And as our faith grows, the effect of the challenges of life and the threats that we've been perceiving as we went through life, the effect upon us is reduced more and more and more as a result of our faith. Yes?
Yes, yeah. As being working the steps and going through the 12 steps and recovery and doing all the 12 steps, and then end up going back out after years, and when you come back into rooms, is it more easier to have that contact with a higher power, and you have to really walk the first step all over again?
Well, the question is whether, having worked the 4th and 5th step and then relapsed, that it's necessary to work the 4th and 5th steps again. It's impossible to answer that because you'd have to look first to see what your 4th step was like. It might have been totally defective. You may not have found the things you must find in order to recover. So you'd have to take a look at that. And if your 4th step was insufficient, your 5th step was likewise. So without seeing what it was you wrote, I couldn't answer your question. All right, so now we come to the last little sentence in that paragraph. We were reborn. Now it's real important for us to make sure we understand what those 3 words mean in AA. It is axiomatic, and it is literally so, that AA is not a religion. And we do not profess religious doctrine or religious dogma as a matter of AA policy or protocol. There are, however, many, many members of Alcoholics Anonymous who have their own personal religious belief system, which may mean that the phrase, we were reborn, has very significant religious connotations for them, and that's fine. If this is the rebirth of the spirit, or if this is that which is necessary to enter into heaven, or whatever, and that is our belief, then that's fine. It just simply is not the only connotation that the words have here. As a matter of fact, in order for us to make sure we understand what we were reborn means here, we have to think back to what we learned, which was that lack of power was our dilemma. Our real problem is that we have no power. Obviously that God has all power and all knowledge and we have none, but we've never known that before. Nobody ever pointed out to us. We thought that our problem, our dilemma, revolved around our past, the rotten things that have happened to us. We thought that our lack of power never even crossed our minds as being the root cause of our problem. As we came in here, a lot of people told us our problem is we drink too much and we're alcoholics. But that's only a symptom of the problem. The problem, as the big book says, this is literally so, our problem is lack of power. And that we had to find a power by which we could live. In other words, our lives depend upon us finding this power and surrendering to this power. Our very lives depend upon it. And so when we look at this, we were reborn. We have to look at it from the standpoint that it was not a lack of power over our actions that the big book's talking about. It's lack of power over our thinking and our reactions to our natural instincts, which have been warped by fear. It is lack of power over all that stuff that's going on in our heads. That's why so many people say that our problem is between our ears. And I guess in one sense that's probably so. So we're going to be, excuse me just a minute, Howie. We are going to be reborn in the sense of a rebirth of thinking. In the promises, what does it say to us? That our whole attitude and outlook upon life will change. And we're going to be restored to sanity, which means very simply that our natural God-given instincts begin to function again as God intended them, free of the effects of fear, which has warped and perverted our natural instincts. And so we're talking here about a rebirth of thinking. Yes, Howie?
Yeah, in the middle of that paragraph, Jim, as we felt new power flowing and we enjoyed peace of mind, and we discovered we could face life successfully, as we became conscious of His presence, we began to lose our fear of today. And after the fifth step, it says specifically, we will know peace for the first time, and our fears will slip away.
Right.
I'm seeing this in the third step.
Right. Remember that the fifth step is talking about the fears we brought in with us. The same fears we discovered when we did our fourth step. And we ask God to remove them, and in the fifth step, we admit them. Our fears fall from us, the fears we brought in. That does not mean that we will have no fear in the future. Quite the contrary. The whole 10th step is there simply because we will continue to react to threat, that fear will crop up again, and that because of that our other defects will be activated. That's why we have a 10th step in the first place. If we were to work a fifth step and believe that from there on we would be free of fear, that's a false notion. That's simply not so, and that's not what it means at all. Okay?
What's the point I'm looking at? As we felt new power flow in, we enjoyed peace of mind. Then again, I go back to the fifth step, we will know peace for the first time.
Right, but that does not mean that it will remain that way. That's why we have a 10th step, an 11th step. Otherwise, there'd be no purpose in the. See, the Oxford people mistook what was happening to them. They thought that we could achieve by working their 6 steps a sort of perfection, and so they simply ignored any work to be done in the future except to carry their message. In other words, to go out as an apostle or a disciple, to preach on the street corners. They failed entirely to understand that, at least for us as alcoholics, when we go out in the world, we're going to continue to be threatened by the world and all of its people. And those threats translate to fear, and fear translates to the recurrence of our defects of character. That's why we have a 10th step, to keep up with that stuff. The gradual fading away of our response to threat is a function of the growth of fear. There will come a time when we have enough faith that we seldom have any fear at all. But that takes time. It takes a lot of time. It's not something that happens to most people while working the steps.
So in the third step, are they talking about the future, when we will know peace?
What does it say? When we sincerely take such a position. That is the surrender. When we have reached the point of surrender. And if that actually happens in the 5th step, then these things will happen in the 5th step. For most people it does not. We do know that these things will happen by the time we reach the 10th step. But there is a continuum here, and many people begin to get a spiritual awakening much sooner than others. What does it say before we're halfway through that the promises will start to come true? We're not looking at steps which are compartmentalized. They form a continuum. They all overlap and they all work together. And somewhere along that line, all these things begin to happen. And for each person, it can be different. There's no way to show a demarcation line where absolutely this is going to happen to everybody. It doesn't work that way. Sue.
You answered it. I was a little confused too about what it said in the 5th step. For the first time, those 3 words. For the first time, we will know peace.
Yes, but that refers to the state of mind that we achieve by doing the 5th step, which has relieved us of all of the stuff that we had as we came in. It takes away all that tension, and all that fear is gone. But it does not say anything about the future. And we know that it does not pretend to settle things for the future. Otherwise we would not have the 8th and 9th steps to finish our amends, and we would not have the 7th step to ask God to take away our defects, and we wouldn't have the 10th step as an ongoing step to take care of the stuff when it comes up. Make sense?
I'm still a drop confused. Please bear with me. Looking in the 3rd step.
I know what he's
In
talking
the
about.
3rd step it says we will know peace. Is that in the future?
Yes. That's what I just got through saying when we got into this paragraph. This paragraph speaks in the future. It does not speak as the 3rd step. Unless, of course, it's somehow miraculously you were able to effect a complete surrender, free of all of those things which block you from God at the 3rd step. And I don't know of anybody who's ever done that. I suppose it's possible, but the big book does not contemplate that kind of a miracle.
So again, the 3rd step is telling us what's going to happen.
This paragraph.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, now let's go to the next paragraph. This is the 3rd step prayer. And it's very, very important for us to take this prayer and parse each sentence so that we can see what it's really saying. Everything in this big book is very dense. Some sentences have 2 or 3 major statements within one sentence. And it's necessary for us to read these things word by word and see how they, not only what it means here, but how they tie in with the other parts of the book, because everything in the big book ties together. That's why we study this book, guys. We just don't read it once and then put it aside. We study it. It's a lifetime of study. And you can be around as long as I have been, and every time you read it, you're going to find something you hadn't seen before. It's amazing what's in here. 164 pages contain what could very easily be expanded to 10 volumes. One thing that's wonderful about this book is it is entirely internally consistent. You will not find an inconsistency anywhere in this book. And I have challenged people all these years to show me one lie, one falsehood, and nobody's ever been able to do that. Now then, this is the 2nd paragraph on 63. We were now at step 3. Many of us said to our Maker as we understood Him, God, I offer myself to Thee. Let's take that. What does the word offer mean? An offer is yet to be accepted. If I offer to pay you $25 to run from here to Commercial and back, I'm going to pay you $25 after you've run to Commercial and back. Not before, because knowing alcoholics, you'd stop right off at the 7-Eleven and we never see you again. So this is an offer. The offer is yet to be accepted. In order for that offer to be accepted, things are going to have to happen. We're going to have to work 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then begin to work 10 and 11, and then that offer will be accepted. I offer myself to thee to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. That's unconditional, isn't it? You see any weasel words there? You see any outs? Are we holding anything back? Are we saying, you can have my life and my will, except I'm going to continue to run my sex life, thank you very much? Because I don't figure I want to go to a nunnery or a monastery or be consigned to a life of celibacy just because you hate me. So I'm not about to let you have that. Of course, I may also want to hold back a little bit on where I work and who my friends are. And I'm not too sure about some of these steps I might otherwise take. I don't know. So the moment that we put any reservations on this, we might as well not say the prayer at all. To build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. A lot of you have heard this before, but I think it's still my best illustration. If you say this, and if you truly are willing to do God's will for you, and a year from now you end up in the outback of Australia running a cattle station with your only friends, the Aborigines, and it's God's will that you be there, you'll be happy as a clam at high tide, because it'll be just exactly the place you're supposed to be. And that's the truth. So when we look at this, I suppose the way our minds work, we don't think in terms of the ultimate resolution of this being something as outlandish as that, but nevertheless it could be. And so, no reservations. The second paragraph relates back to those, the second sentence relates back to those paragraphs on page 62 that we spent so much time studying. This business about self and selfishness and self-delusion and self-pity and fear. Picture your spirit in a psychic fetal position, bound up with ropes and chains, and unable to be freed and soar with the angels. And we're asking God now to set us free from that. As a matter of fact, in chapter 9 it talks about God's will for us is that we be happy, joyous, and free. And that means freedom from the bondage of self. And so we ask God for that here. Relieve me of the bondage of self. Break these chains and ropes and cables that bind my soul. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Now we could just as easily say, if I could be released from the bondage of self, then I can go out and make my fortune. I can do all kinds of stuff that I haven't been able to do before. So therefore, if you do this for me, I can probably have a house on the bay and a 50-foot Matthews and Corvette in the driveway, lots of money in the bank, and everybody would love me because I was rich. And I've been rich and I've been poor, and I like rich better, but that's not what this means. That I may better do thy will. In other words, it is axiomatic, is it not, that if I am bound up in self, I am disabled from doing God's will. We learn this again when we get up to the 9th step. The Big Book tells us that it is our real purpose here is to fit ourselves to be of maximum service to God and the people about us. We can't do that when we're tied up in self. There's another factor here too, which is very important to understand. That when I am buried in my own head, that's a perfect definition of insanity. all those thoughts in collision in my head and no resolution, it's about as crazy you can get. So we're asking God to take care of this problem for us. Now the third sentence is a part of the prayer which will be answered in the 12th step. Now let's see what it says. Take away my difficulties. What does that mean? Obviously, it refers to our defects of character, to our insanities, and to our guilt. Take away my difficulties. Relieve me of the burden of my insanity. Relieve me of the burden of my guilt. And take away these defects of character, my warped natural instincts. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them, that is the victory now that God will give us over these difficulties, may bear witness to those I would help. We're asking God here to make us an example. By taking away these things which are killing us and blocking us from Him, we're asking Him to make an example to the people we want to help of what? Of how great we are or how great we have become? Not at all. Of Thy power, Thy love, and Thy way of life. We're asking God to make us the walking, talking, living example of God's power and love working in our lives, so that when they see us and they see how we act, not what we talk about, because talk is cheap, but how we act, they will perhaps want what we have and be willing to go to any lengths to get it. The greatest impact we can ever have in carrying God's message is by way of our example. There's something that happens between human beings when the example is concrete and right in front of them, which cannot be achieved any other way. And when somebody comes to you trying to help you who has not been through this, has not lived in hell as we have, has not had to go through a process of self-examination and seeking a higher power and delivering their spirit to that higher power and surrendering and being obedient and continue to do this day after day after day. If they haven't done that, they don't know what the hell they're saying. They don't know what they're talking about with us. If they haven't been there, they can't know. The person who is going to help us is the person who's been there. Can show us by his or her example that it really, really works. Because so much of the time, you know, when we hear things, we may be interested in them. And when we see them, we may even believe they're so. But when we experience them, then we understand them. And this is why it is that we understand God. The God of our understanding is the God we've experienced. Now this experience may have come to us as an epiphany. It may have come to us as a rebirth in church. It may have come to us over a long period of time as by reason of the leaps of faith which we've taken, where we've asked God to come into our lives and help. And He has. And we've experienced His power working in our lives. And we therefore have developed faith, because faith means that we trust God. How important is faith? Only everything. Bill says that we must practice faith 24 hours a day. Faith must work in and through us 24 hours a day, or we perish. So ultimately what we're working toward here is the coming of faith, so that after a while we no longer have to force ourselves to do what we ought to do. As Dr. Bob says, I do what I ought to do because I want to do it, because it's the right thing, because it works. And so in the 11th, in the 12th step, this third sentence will be answered. This part of the prayer will be answered. The 12th step tells us that we will be then empowered, because we have had a spiritual awakening, to carry this message to other alcoholics. And we will have the opportunity to do so if we wish to do it. And if we fail to do that, we will eventually drink again. And then finally, may I do thy will always. And we will see that repeated over and over again in the big book. Ultimately, we're going to be told this, that the proper use of our will is to will ourselves, to turn our will over to God. It sounds like a conundrum, but it's not. It's the thing that we must do. The proper use of my will is to turn my will over to God. In other words, to make myself do it until it becomes second nature. We go down in the last full paragraph, 4 lines up in the bottom of that paragraph, you'll notice the words, voicing it without reservation. That's referring to the third step prayer. We say that prayer without reservation. We're going to be looking at tradition 3 tonight, and if you haven't been with us before in this little group, we feel free to express ourselves as the Spirit moves us, to ask questions or to participate in any way that you feel is be helpful to yourself or to the group, or to everybody. Let's take a look, if you have your big book, forward to the first edition. We find on page 14, XIV, Roman 14. This, of course, is the forward of the first edition, which was drafted and printed in 1939. There are no fees or dues whatsoever. The only requirement for membership is an honest desire to stop drinking. We are not allied to any particular faith, sect, or denomination, nor do we oppose anyone. We simply wish to be helpful to those who are afflicted. They dropped the word honest out of that later on because it's pretty obvious, is it not, that a desire which is not honest is not a desire. It may be something else, but it sure as heck isn't a desire. So some groups have gotten into the semantics trap of saying you have a desire to stop drinking, honest or dishonest, ha, ha, ha. Well, a desire is a desire. We either have it or we don't. Now, this third tradition is a very important one, and we got into discussion of this a little bit this afternoon in the workshop. You notice that all the way back in 1939, we were saying that the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. And that's exactly what this tradition says, is it not? And this was adopted in 1950 by the First International, as were all the other traditions. Bill had written the long form, and then they condensed that long form into the so-called short form, which is the one that we have on the wall. Bill had written these traditions beginning about 1945 or 46 at the request of the fellowship, at least some of the senior members. And the idea was that he was to go through and pull out what had been learned by the various groups over the years as things that were absolutely necessary for us to abide by if we were to hope to survive. But they could not be made as rules because AA doesn't have any rules. We have 0 rules, although a lot of people, a lot of groups think we should have, and they go to great pains to draft all these bylaws and all this stuff. One of the silly ones, the other night at another group, the motion was proposed that could not reconsider a motion which had been passed for 9 months after it had been passed. And I raised the question, how in the world do we justify that if what we're really saying is that we are going to deny God the right to speak to us through our group conscience for 9 months? How do we go about doing that? Because if we are truly in that the only authority we follow is a loving God as He expressed Himself to our group conscience, then we have absolutely no right and no ability actually to stop God from expressing Himself. If He wants to, He's going to. Of course, if that happens to get adopted, and I'm going to try to help to see that it doesn't, we're taking a position that God's directions for the group are to be dictated by the group. And the problem, there are a lot of problems with that, but one of them is that these traditions are spiritual principles, which apply just as much to us as they do to the group. We can gain much from these traditions, which we can apply in our individual lives. If we are in a state of surrender, the 11th step teaches us that we pray only for knowledge of God's will for us and the power to carry that out. And we do that every day. But in our groups, we are presumptively decide that we are not going to allow God to speak except at our will. And certainly we're not going to permit this to happen except in those time periods that we've already decided on our own. We're going to then try to say that it was God's will that we have a 9-month wait between the time that we adopt one motion and before that can be reconsidered or changed. That sounds like a pretty thin excuse to me. But anyway, the requirements of AA membership, a desire to stop drinking, this was an easy one for Bill to write because it was already there. But what we have to understand is it was not honored at all. Almost every group had devised their own set of entry requirements. And some of them were very restrictive. I mean, they were asking in some groups, in New York, for example, they wanted you to give them a financial statement. They wanted to see literally that you were able to sustain yourself financially. They didn't want any bums hanging out in their group. What happened eventually is that by reviewing all of these membership requirements of various groups, they found that nobody in the first 100 could have been a member. If you put all those requirements together, they would have all been barred. And all of these requirements for membership were fear-based because each one of them had to do with the people in the group not wanting to have to associate with any lowlifes. And they were scared to death that their image would be tarnished if they had a bunch of bums and crooks. They certainly didn't want any gay people around. And it was, it was a travesty. But it all came out of fear. And one of the things we have to recognize about the traditions is that the traditions totally and completely reject fear as a motive or as the progenitor of any of our group actions. We do not act out of fear. Well, this is the same for us individually, isn't it? When we are acting out of fear, we certainly are not acting in connection with God's will for us. Acting out of fear is the exact opposite of being in a state of surrender and doing God's will. Fear is our enemy. Fear is the enemy of AA, and it's the enemy of the individual members. And so these restrictive membership requirements all arose out of fear. And there was much more besides, because all the way through Bill found that fear was the motive force behind so much of what was going on. Another thing that we notice with these traditions is that none of them say you must, but say we ought. We ought to do this, not we must do this. Therefore, we call these traditions rather than rules. The traditions are not the bylaws of AA. And this is simply because they are spiritual principles which are stated as things we ought to do. Yes, Tom?
I have a question on the second tradition. I go to a meeting frequently because it's convenient for me, and they have a business meeting once a month. And they do institute a lot of rules. But I'm not so particularly concerned with that. But my question is, it's still a group conscience. Now, if I'm chairing a meeting and somebody does something and it might be against one of those rules. Is it okay for me to take a group conscience with the people that are right there that'll supersede the monthly group conscience? In other words, can you take individual group consciences at an individual meeting that'll supersede the?
Why not? It's a meeting of the group, isn't
I
it?
don't know. You know, it's a meeting, but it hasn't. It's not the business meeting. It's not the.
So what?
Okay, that's all I want to know.
Good question.
That is a good question. But you see, these business meetings are artificial constructs. They don't have any backup. There's no authorization in the traditions for us to limit group conscience only to those times we have a meeting which we designate for God to have the right to speak to us. How silly is that?
That's right.
But that's what we do.
Thanks.
Now everybody says, but otherwise it'll be chaos. Well, that's the name of the game, guys. Clarence Snyder used to say that unity in AA is chaos. That's why we are unified. If we didn't have chaos, somebody would be sure to take over. You want some president for life, Bill Wilson III, who appoints all the people who are going to tell you what you're to do. You want an AA police force. You want kangaroo courts. You want people to make you sit down and as they circle around you and decide whether you can become a member or not. I mean, we can't have it both ways. It's either total laissez-faire, trusting God and knowing that alcoholism is a self-cleaning oven. And those who do not abide by the principles will not stay. Yes, Carol.
I thought that was an excellent question too, because we just ran across that and they said at our group that we couldn't have group conscience because the members of that group weren't there. So that's just about what you're saying, is that we can only have God present when the members are present. That's how I took it to be.
But then the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking.
Well, you see, again, the idea that
Collective membership.
the idea that that there is membership in a particular group, which is some kind of exclusive thing,
Right.
is not traditional.
Mm-hmm.
It's customary, but it is not part of these traditions. If I am a member of AA, I am by force, I am a member of any group. Now the groups have the right to exclude me if they wish, because they are autonomous. But that does not mean that that they're following the tradition. I mean, I'm not permitted to walk into a woman's meeting. I'll be mobbed and shoved out the door, or at least asked to leave. And yet, under the traditions, I have an absolute right to be there. Just as a woman would have a right to be at a men's meeting. I never go to any men's meetings. That's a phony baloney deal. The big book is absolutely clear about this. The world of spirit is broad, roomy, all-inclusive, never exclusive or forbidding. It is open, we believe, to all. And when we go against that, what we are doing is we are isolating ourselves as to one segment of our group, and there can't be anything that I can see which is any less spiritual than that, because we're denying God's power, we're denying recovery to the people that we're excluding, and that's not right.
I disagree with that because when I sponsor people, certain ones, all they're interested in is the women, and I tell them to go to men's meetings. They don't want to go to men's meetings. And I think that women can be distracting at times, especially at the 8:30 meeting that you just spoke at. You know, it's like a fashion show or a meeting place or a lover's lane type thing. And I also think that you can't be totally honest when there's a bunch of women that you might be trying to impress. But in a men's meeting, you can get honest. You can tell on yourself where you might not, with women present. I mean, it's just that ego, that macho type thing. So I do believe in men's meetings. I go to a lot of them because I still get distracted very easily.
Okay.
Thank God for that.
Okay. We're talking. I'm talking about now the traditions and what we find in the big book, and I certainly would not argue with your point of view, Tom. You know, that's. And you may very well be right. which would mean that the big book is wrong.
Well, it's just interpreted wrong.
Oh,
It
yes.
says we are a fellowship of men and women. That doesn't mean necessarily men and women together. It can mean exclusively men and exclusively women. I mean, it doesn't say exactly how it's supposed to be.
Okay.
It says it's open to all. You know? How come there's black meetings?
So,
Well,
Chinese.
I'm talking about right here in
Spanish.
Florida. Right here in Florida.
course.
There's strictly black meetings.
Of course. Strictly
It's-
Spanish
it's-
meetings,
It's
too.
not according to tradition, I don't think.
Gay meetings.
Right.
And the gays would have the same argument as you have. Well, I don't want to go to a straight meeting. I might get distracted by some of the things that they're doing. There might even be a cute guy in there that I could really
I
fall
don't think
for.
that's the same because they got their own kind. They're attracted to each other.
Okay. So what we're looking, yes.
I see that as a choice, though. Like,
Yeah.
like Tom said, where the men go to the men's meetings, they can go to a regular meeting with, you know, with women there too. But like sometimes, you know, men have a girlfriend that they want to speak about, and you know what I mean. It'd be a choice,
Sure.
and then the women go to their meetings because they have, you know, their husbands or their boyfriends that they want to speak.
Okay, but I'll get to you in a second, Carol. I just want to postulate something for you, which you're probably not aware of, or not used to at least. There are a lot of parts of this world, and many parts of this country, where there's one group. And sometimes only one meeting a week. Now, if that happened to be a men's group, would you say it would be proper to exclude the women from it? So what you're really saying is that since there is this 750 some meetings in Broward, that you got all kinds of choices. So what difference does it make if some men over here say you're a woman, you can't come in? You can run over here and go to this meeting, and you can get what you need, right? Well, these traditions do not recognize the exceptions to the rule, because they lay down spiritual principles. The principle is that the fellowship should be open to all. Yes, Carol?
Well, you kind of answered my question, but I mean, it's like if you had something to say at a meeting that you felt uncomfortable with, whether it be a mixed meeting, isn't that what sponsorship's for?
Absolutely.
Well, you know, that's just my personal opinion. If I couldn't talk about it at a meeting, but also I wanted to say that the minute I separate myself and I go to a women's meeting, my sponsor told me, then I start thinking I'm different, and I'm not. I'm an alcoholic.
Right.
Different from who? All the other women?
No.
No, the men. You are different from the men.
I am different from the men, but I am an alcoholic first, and that's what I must remember. The minute I start going to this meeting because of that reason or this reason, then I start entertaining myself that I'm different.
You're right, Carol. Let's take another analogy, because you're right on the money. One of the things that Bill always talked about, and it's in the literature, that we're like the survivors of a shipwreck in a lifeboat. All of us together. And our survival, individual survival, depends upon this group's unity and pulling together. According to some theories, if there were men and women in that lifeboat, the women would be perfectly fine to go to the bow and the men to the stern and independently decide how they were going to save themselves. And then act independently of each other in terms of not getting killed and finally surviving. And that's, of course, absurd. Because in that lifeboat, it requires that each of us pull together. The first tradition is so clear about this. Personal recovery depends upon the unity of the fellowship. Unity means one. It does not mean separate little groups hanging out over here and making themselves independent of the rest of the groups and making themselves exclusive and saying, we're women, you men can't come in. We're men, you women can't come in. We're gay, if you're not gay, you can't come in. We're black, this is for blacks only. if we can assume, if we can understand that we're all in this together, and Carol is right on, then with anything that would split us up and cause disunity is absolutely against the traditions. And I don't care how you cut it. As far as I'm concerned, it violates some of the basic rules of recovery. That everything that we do is open to any member, period. And if the moment that we begin to decide who can be at a meeting and who can't, I believe we put ourselves beyond the pale. That's my belief. And I think that it's borne out by the traditions and by the big book.
Yeah, one of my very spiritual readings, and I just love what it says for me. It says, just because we might be sailing in different directions, we're all in the same boat.
Yep. Now, there's a practical problem here, because it is true what Tom was talking about. When you're sponsoring people, you try and do the best you can for them. There are a lot of people that we sponsor who have great difficulty in dealing with their sexuality, for example, and there's strong urges and motivations. Nevertheless, the big book says that all of these are God-given and therefore good. And the solution is not to stay away from the opposite sex. The solution is to be willing to accept God's will in each matter. And and if it's particularly difficult, we go to Him and we ask Him for help and we meditate about it. And then if it's still particularly difficult, the solution is not to stay away from those others, the other sex, but to turn our thoughts resolutely to someone we can help. Because that will quiet the imperious urge when to yield will mean heartache. So there are practical considerations, no doubt about it. But I much prefer that we stick with the spiritual solutions, because I believe in the long run that's the only thing that will really work. Just the same as trying to deny somebody their alcohol. Take away this person's alcohol so they'll stop drinking. It doesn't work. They're going to find it somewhere. Big Book tells us so clear, and I think this theory, these truisms apply in all different parts of our recovery. Any scheme of combating alcoholism which proposes to shield the sick man from temptation is doomed to failure. If the alcoholic tries to shield himself, he may succeed for a time, but he usually winds up with a bigger explosion than ever. We've tried these methods. These attempts to do the impossible have always failed. And substitute any scheme combating lust and the imperious urge which proposes to shield the sick man from temptation is doomed to fail. I believe that.
It still goes back to no human solution.
Huh?
It still goes back to no human solution.
Well, see, the problem is that in some ways these things that we do can help, but I think they're more in the nature of a Band-Aid. It may be that it helps for the moment. Now, if I go into somebody's house where they're drinking, I pour all their booze down the sink, and I'm pretty sure they have no more money to buy any more. They may stop for a while, but they're going to go out and find a way to get money. If they have to rob a 7-Eleven or beg on the street corner or sell roses down here on Federal, they'll find a way to do it. So I haven't really helped them to solve their problem, because, every single aspect of our recovery is a part of the total failure of our spiritual resources. See, that's the problem. And so the solution is always the same. When the spiritual malady is overcome, then we straighten out mentally and physically. And so the things which would otherwise tear us apart are amenable to a spiritual solution which restores our spiritual fitness. That's what I believe works, and I think that we need to concentrate our efforts there. In any event, the tradition 3, and a couple of us, in fact, a bunch of us got into a discussion of this at the workshop, and I think it's worth, Tom, it's okay, I'd like to go back over what we talked about this afternoon. Because this is a very, very important question. It revolves around this question of, can an addict be a member? And this is answered for us in the third tradition in the 12 and 12. We're not now saying that anyone who can willy-nilly come in here and just because he is an addict or she is an addict can be a member. What we're saying is that we cannot question anyone's membership. You are a member when you say you are. You can declare yourself in. Nobody can keep you out. No matter who you are, no matter how low you've gone, no matter how grave your emotional complications, even your crimes,